each other because we are so different. I'm a biologist, I'm a neuroscientist, and throughout my life I work on between fields. So I'm a computational biology in not in training but in practice. And just to say that being a computational biology by definition means that you always try to find the border of your discipline and to go out and to search for some connection, some bridge to other disciplines. And I won't give you a speech about what it is all about, but it's really on the idea of trying to find design principle in cellular system, in the brain, to understand how come that you can look at one point on all, let's say, your genes, your proteins, your metabolites in a cell, and by snapshotting this, try to understand how this cell can cope with, let's say, high sugar, or with aging, or where memories are encoded. And when I talk like this, you can see quite clearly that I'm not so different from you, in the sense that, you know, a lot of things in social science, in humanities, are asking the same questions. Maybe the terminology is a little bit different, but sometimes I find that the route, the way to find the answer is far more interesting and challenging than finding the answer itself. And I think this meeting is all about this, all about hearing you and challenging you, asking questions, trying to stimulate a dialogue that otherwise you may not talk to yourself in those terms. And I think I really want the discussion to be the main focus of our meeting. So please, I'll be very pragmatic. As you know, I'm taking also responsibility for the time that Olivier appears, the time of his staff being here, and I'm doing it pretty well up to now. So please keep your time on the talks short enough so that we'll have enough discussion time. That's one element. The other, to people that have materials on their institute and they want to share, there is a table that please put everything there so it will be a place where people can share. The other technical point is that the posters, some of you brought poster, will be presented from lunch and on till the end of the meeting. So that's another just practical question. And for people that needs to do payment and so on, it's room 31. Just go there and finish the business there. And I think by that, maybe I'll stop. And if you want to understand better what's going on in our institute, we have some highlights of what's going on. And I put quite a lot of annual report and so on. And the best way is to ask. And by that, I also want to thank tremendously the staff and Iris for everything. And please, Olivier, who writes his notes now. So please, Olivier. No, I know.
Thank you, Michal. Since we're already a little bit late, I will be quick. So I'm Olivier Bouin. I'm the Secretary General of the Network of Institute for Advanced Study and the, I would say, the founder, but because Mylène Trouvé is now the head coordinator of the EURIAS program she does, I want to give her and Raquel and Marie van de Vanter the credit for like running so well this entire program. So we as you know, it's a Marie Curie action, and we got co-funding from the European Commission back in 2010. So you were the fifth cohort of EURIAS fellows, and up to now, I think we gathered 160 fellows in 5 cohorts. The first one was in 2011, 2012, and now you are the 5th academic year of this EURIAS program. I'm sure you have received this booklet, which is put together by Raquel and Marie, and so where you can find your co-fellows, and we in the 16 institutes of the consortium. This means that it's the first time Institute for Advanced Study really embark into a collaborative project. Many institutes had bilateral, trilateral collaborations, but it's the first time that we have a kind of pan-European project and fellowship program where you have that many institutions that are recognized from the individual excellence, but have been willing at some point to pool their notoriety and their international visibility and the excellence of their research networks. They have decided to pull that together in order to have one joint program where we could apply for funding to the European Union, but more importantly, where you could apply to get a chance to stay in one of the 16 institutes of the consortium, because what we tried to do back in 2009 and 10, when with colleagues from the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin were putting together the application, the idea was that we should offer a possibility for many scholars across the planet, around the world, to have a chance to candidate and apply in an open application, peer-reviewed, with an international scientific board that would provide for transparency and competence in the selection, that we would share our best practices in order to have like a two-level selection process. I don't want to say that to you now, but you have survived a really selective process, because the success rate is around 5%. 5 to 6%. This means that after the first 2 years, we have now only, because of the very high success, very low success rate and very high selectivity, we have screamed out, in a sense, the most feeble candidates. So this means that we have only very good applications, and we've seen consistently over the past 6 years now the average quality of the application, of the applicant, and of his or her research project really increasing. And even, I would say, the most renowned institutes in the game have been happy selecting people, scholars like you, to be part of this area fellowship program. So I would like to compliment you for having made it so far to your institutes and even to Jerusalem for this meeting that we consider an important meeting, because Institutes for Advanced Study, even though they are highly different in organizations, and we had a meeting yesterday that showed up, again, the sheer diversity of this group of 16 Institutes for Advanced Study. Some of them are university-based, some of them are independent, some of them focus on groups and themes, some of them are more relying on individual excellence, some of them are focusing on more junior fellows, some of them are, but all of them, they focus on individual excellence of the scholar and of his or her research project. But I would say, not more importantly, but on the top of that, what we try to provide, and which is different from any kind of, I would say, research facility or research infrastructure or research center you would find anywhere, is that we promote some kind of interdisciplinary and international dialogue. And this is the occasion for you to go beyond the community or the co-fellows of your institute in one of the 16 institutions, but to have the possibility to meet other co-fellows of this program and try to figure out during these 2 days, but also maybe after, because as a Marie Curie action, we're supposed to help you have an impact on your career, on your research projects, on the development of programs or initiatives that you would like to have. So please use, and I really I'm in line with Michal, as always, that we should keep presentation as short as possible so that we have as much time for dialogue and for discussions and questions as possible, so that you have a sense, because you are from very different disciplines. So the idea is not to have lengthy presentations getting into the very details of your research, but to give the overview, the idea, the salt of your research, so that we can really build and you can have some possibilities of exchanges. Don't be shy asking questions. It's really a group. It's a peer group. You know, we all newcomers in many of the topics that will be dealt with today. We try to put together with the very wide range of topics. We try to bring some consistent sessions around one topic, even if you have like different disciplinary approaches or time references or spatial references. So we try to bring these short sessions as lively as possible and as dialogic as possible, so that we can really learn from each other in a rather fast-forward possibility. So we have 2 days. I would say that, as usual, coffee breaks and lunches, dinners, social events are really a way to mutualize and to socialize, to have the possibility to learn a little bit more from each other, and maybe as an unexpected outcome, the famous serendipity, but that maybe some of you would find a common ground or a common energy to focus on one question, one issue, one research theme, and develop. And we are here, all the directors will be, most of them will be directors of one session, and we'll enforce these 2 strict rules, short presentations and dynamic dialogue. We are here to help you. We are not here to compliment ourselves and say how great these institutes are, but institutes are great if these fellowship residencies are important for you and are really productive. So do not hesitate to get to any of the directors. We don't have a colored tag, but you will recognize, I think, most of us. And we are here to make this 2 days very special, as would say Michal, and we hope that you will enjoy the conference. Let me say a final word. I started by thanking my partners and collaborators, but I would like to thank Michal, Iris, and her team here for the wonderful hospitality. And we already had a great day yesterday, so I'm sure we have for 2 other nice days. Thank you. And I ask Simon, the to chair, is the head of CRASH, the director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Cambridge, England, as you mentioned yesterday, the other Cambridge, also known as the other Cambridge, and you will chair a session with 2 and president as since yesterday of the network of European Institute for Advanced Study. So acclamations. And Michal, there's a rotating presidency, so it will be Simon the first year and Michal on the second year. So now it's such an important, honor to be presiding the, so that we decided to share this very nice opportunity. But you will chair the first session as president of NETIAS and director of CRASH, and on late antiquity. And so I will you call the 2 speakers for the first session. Thank you, Simon.
I do, if I may, have one technical thing.
Yeah.
We're recording the session, and if you do not speak to the microphone, it will not be recorded. So, okay, so you can take it with you. It's movable.
All right, okay. Well, no, I'll let the speaker come. Okay, first, the first session is on late antiquity, and we have 2 speakers. The first from Glasgow, though he's not Glaswegian, Jan Stenger, who will come and speak first, and then Glenn Pierce from the University of Texas at Austin, and I will give no further introductions than that so that we can have discussion. Except to say that I will stop the speaker at 20 minutes, whatever they are saying.
I'll keep this in mind. Right, it's a great honor to be a member of this community and a great pleasure to be here. It's actually my first visit to Israel and to Jerusalem, although my topic is located exactly in this region in ancient Palestine, in Gaza, not far away from here. and the topic is education in late antiquity. Right, I'll start with a quote. Around 530 CE, Coricius, the head of the rhetorical school in Gaza, delivered a public eulogy of his deceased teacher Procopius. In the middle of the praise, he pauses for a moment to ponder, quote, "This man, I mean the deceased, as it seems, never touched the divine scriptures. What leisure did he have, dividing his energy among so many virtues? If someone was ignorant of him, he might form such an opinion. But in fact, he had such a great share in this kind of erudition that, apart from the ordination alone, he was a priest in every respect." This extract seems to articulate public criticism in Gaza against the scholar Procopius. The anonymous critic is suspicious of Procopius' overemphasis on Greek schooling, playing off scripture against Homer and the rest of pagan literature. Around the same time, the monk John in the vicinity of Gaza was approached with a question about the criteria according to which the local bishop should select and promote clerics. John had suggested to the bishop a number of suitable candidates from a list. However, the bishop still had doubts. Quote, "How can such people, these clerics on the list, even deal with their affairs or be charged with any important responsibilities? For they are unskilled in speaking, and so they might easily be despised by the people." To this, John responded, "Even if you appoint people unable to speak and without understanding, God will render them administrators and advocates more impressive than any magistrates. Otherwise, even if you send an advocate who is skilled in rhetoric, he will return just as he left." The disagreement is caused by opposing views on the relevance of skills imparted by the established schools. These two passages are evidence of a sustained and intense debate over education in late antique Gaza. They document controversy over fundamental binary opposition, that of classical formal education and religious formation. Two alternative value systems seem to clash in a Christian society. On the one hand, traditional upper-class norms, on the other, faith and religious virtues. My research in Helsinki revolves around two key questions. First, what ideas about education did secular and religious leaders in Gaza promote, and for what purposes? And second, how did they negotiate the place of classical education in a changing society? The scope of my paper does not allow detailed exploration of these topics, but I would like to present one possible response to the issue. First, some comments on the historical context are in order. Here you can see the famous mosaic from the church in Madaba in Jordan, and that's exactly contemporary to the views that I just quoted. It's from the first half of the 6th century. And you can see there the city of Gaza, at least in part, with a theater and porticos and church buildings and walls. It's a typical Greek polis with all components that a polis needs to have. And in the vicinity of Gaza, we have a number of monasteries. One is in Tawata, that's here on the right side of Gaza, and that's exactly the place where this monk John lived in the monastery. And Gaza at this time was the seat of Roman military and civil administration. It was situated at the crossroads of trade routes, and the city was an important center of commercial activity. The main trade was in wine, for which Gaza was famous in antiquity. Gaza was also characterized by an encounter of cultures. The population comprised Greeks, Jews, and other ethnicities. While the city was firmly Christianized, there were, apart from the Jews, still also pagan inhabitants. One important feature was that Gaza, as I said, was surrounded by a cluster of monasteries. These cenobia were not isolated communities, but entertained intimate contacts with lay people in the villages and in the city of Gaza itself. In one of these monastic communities, as I said, lived John, this monk who gave the response to the local bishop of Gaza. Here are again some facts about Gaza. To understand the significance of the education discourse at Gaza, I'll briefly introduce what has become the general consensus on the relationship between Christianity and classical culture in the 6th century. In her magisterial study of Christian discourse in late antiquity, Averil Cameron has argued that Christian manners of expression came to dominate the social discourse as a whole in the Roman Empire. Under the Emperor Justinian, she argues, this discourse became totalizing and prevailing. And that was because of the increasing limitations on the availability of the system of education that had been shared by all members of the upper class. Books ceased to be readily available in this period, and learning became an increasingly ecclesiastical preserve. Other scholars too have emphasized that, to quote Francis Young, Scripture replaced the classics in the formation of a distinctive culture. So the general picture is that of Christian modes of expression superseding the classical frame of reference, and that means in particular classical literature, Homer, Plato, the historians, and so on. These claims are borne out on the face of it by textual evidence from Gaza. We just have seen one case in point in monk John's directive to the bishop. Let me give you another example from the same monk in the same monastery. John also was asked by a layman about social contacts in the city. Quote, "If I am sitting beside an elderly man or someone else important who is reading, and if that person happens to err on some accent or word, and if I know the proper way of reading, should I correct him or not?" The ascetic monk replied, "If you know that this person will gladly listen to you, then correct him. If not, then say nothing. Be careful also not to accept vainglory through your thoughts. Indeed, it is more beneficial for you to keep silent than to say anything with vainglory." The response blandly rejects the established code of the educated elite. Rhetorical education in antiquity put much emphasis on proper pronunciation and accentuation, on correct grammar and pure Attic style. That had been the ticket to success in the imperial society for centuries. John's main objection is that the display of formal education is at odds with Christian, especially ascetic virtues. For in the Gazan monasteries, the main goal was to foster humility and implant strict obedience. And that is in contradiction to this show-off of erudition and knowledge. Similarly, in a talk given to his disciples in the monastery on the virtue of humility, the abbot Dorotheus flatly dismisses the value of formal instruction and emphasizes instead unconditional obedience to the elders. He says, in the context of this lecture on the master virtue of humility, no one can explain how this humility comes about, how humility is generated in the soul. Unless a man learns this by experience, he cannot learn it by verbal teaching. Interestingly, this passage is from a discussion between a secular teacher of rhetoric, and a Christian ascetic, which Dorotheus relates to his audience. And in this conversation between the sophist and the monk, it is of course the monk who wins the argument and demonstrates to the sophist that you don't need formal knowledge, it's only habituation and practice of virtue and even physical labor that's important, and not learning the alphabet or anything like this. On another occasion, Dorotheus deals with the monk's journey on the path to God. There he defines virtue as the middle road between excess and lack. He says, virtue stands in the middle. This is the royal road, of which one of the elders used to say, walk by the royal road and count up the miles. The virtues, therefore, as we say, are in the middle between excess and defect. It is striking that Dorotheus here acknowledges his intellectual debt to the Desert Fathers and also to St. Basil in some sentences below this quote, but makes no reference whatsoever to Aristotle, nor indeed to any other pagan philosopher. In actual fact, his definition of virtue as the middle between excess and lack is an almost verbatim quotation of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This silence on the classical sources is quite characteristic of Dorotheus' instructions, which draw on Greek philosophy but never reveal their pagan sources. So we can say that the monks at Gaza hold that formal schooling is overrated and has to give way to Christian habituation, not only in the monastery but also in the secular sphere. Both monks also talk to lay people, not only to their fellow brothers in the monastery. With the rhetorical school, we get a different picture. To begin with, Coricius highlights, as we have seen, Procopius' Christian scholarship, his studies in the Holy Scripture. But he also praises his teacher's charitable activities. He says, his knowledge of sacred learning was by no means superficial. He pursued this type of education not only up to the discussion and the exhortation of others, but displayed his knowledge through his actions. Many orphans did not notice their condition. Many women took their widowhood lightly because he alleviated their suffering. He persuaded many people who were bound up with unnatural desires to become restrained. Procopius consoles and supports widows and orphans. He provides relief to those who suffer from poverty, illness, or grief. And such activities are typical of late antique bishops and priests. Coricius' eulogy presents the sophist almost as a holy man who provides care for the marginalized and offers patronage to the lower classes. However, Coricius throughout emphasizes Procopius' role as a public leader and an orator. The deceased sophist restores the mental health of others and contributes to a healthy society, primarily through skillful persuasion, that is, on the basis of his classical schooling. More than that, references to Thucydides and other classical authors make clear that Procopius is a powerful and energetic civic leader, like the Athenian general Pericles. In addition, Coricius suggests a close link between the study of classical literature and the control of passions and coping with suffering. Addressing the mourning relatives of Procopius, he points out that a person who has thoroughly studied tragedy, rhetoric, and historiography will be able to overcome grief and cope with any hardship. He says, since long poets have been proclaiming this, as well as those who practice philosophy and the rhetors and the historians, concurring in one point and all agreeing with each other to put forward one single view about the evils of human life. The wiser Procopius was than others, the happier he was, if in fact wisdom, according to Plato's definition, is the crown of happiness, and no word about scripture or God at all. Philosophy is even defined as the essence of human happiness, the core of human life. All in all, Coricius maintains the social role and functions of his profession. The funeral oration suggests that Christian values are fitted into the classical framework rather than the other way around. The result is a seamless continuity between religious devotion and secular education, instead of disruption or replacement of one by the other. Coricius' response to the issue seems to be that the religious question does not matter. In a way of a conclusion, just a couple of thoughts. I think that the local debate on education has wider significance for the cultural discourse in that time. The contributions from Gaza shed light on the polyphonic cultural discourse rather than a triumphant Christian monologue. That points to the fact that at the time, classical culture was no longer a shared authoritative paradigm. Yet Christian discourse had not completely taken over as the universally accepted frame of reference either. Instead, we find a plurality of coexisting responses. Evidently, the question of cultural dominance had not been settled yet. Second, the main point in the debate was the relationship between sacred and secular, which had to be constantly negotiated. What was controversial was no longer the issue of Christian versus pagan, but the main controversy arose from the question of the canon. How meaningful and useful can the great classics, the dead white males of Europe, still be? Are they still the benchmark in the Christian empire? And third, Coricius' dealing with this issue exhibits a remarkable adaptability. His solution, namely that classical schooling fulfills vital functions for the society and the individual, and that it is compatible with faith, ensures the survival, or at least the partial survival, of classical culture in a Christianized society. Thank you.
Okay.
As I promised you, a lot of surprises. So, but don't worry, I'm not taking your time. Thank you so much, and your time. But I would like to introduce Menachem Ben Sasson, who is the president of the Hebrew University, who is running between two events, but he insisted of coming and give us his greetings. So please, Menachem. Yeah.
I'm sorry, man. It was fascinating. And you know, I'm actually in between because I was just running out of a conference on the end of life. Exactly, that's what we heard about dead white. and then you connect it to late antiquity. So what is late? What is antiquity? And in the next session, you are going to deal with books. So I'd like to refer to a few points and to thank you for coming, first and foremost. I know that you came for business. I saw the business plan of you. I was running over the Vienna sessions that you were into. Oh, my teacher is here. Benny. Excuse me. He was my mentor for a while. He was my tournamenter. He insisted on getting, you know, at that time, I'm old, not as young as he is. And he insisted of getting the papers from us typed. At that time, it was unique. He was the only one at the Hebrew University. And the papers that I had to submit to him was the world of Islam in the eyes of the European medieval writers. And I was given the honor to write on Dante. The result of it, let's not talk about it. But I would like really to thank you first and foremost for coming. It's not self-understood nowadays. You'll come back home, people look at you as heroes. You came from a world wherever everybody is stabbed, everybody is in danger, and you feel very much at home, justifiably so. You know, Europe is also not the safest place from many points of view. However, I would like to talk about neighbors. You do not have any doubt that whenever you are in Vienna or in Berlin, I visited some of you, I enjoyed a few days in some of the institutes. When I worked on my papers, I know nothing before the 7th century as a person and nothing after the 14th century. In between, I studied something. But you look for neighbors, and for you it's very easy. You cross the border that used to be, and you've got a neighbor. Even borders and walls in the past are relatively easy. Languages are not a barrier nowadays. Not that we all speak English, not even a broken one like myself, but there is one language that we all speak, the language of science. Being in charge of institutes of advanced studies in Europe, you do not have a problem when talking about neighbors. And we are not accepted in our neighborhood the way we are accepted in your neighborhood. So we had to create a bridge. And the bridge, as I said, is the science, the scientific word, the scientific work, the scientific institutes, and that's the only way we bridge between ourselves and yourselves. So even if you do not feel this problem of isolation, we do feel it. Not because of boycotts, that's not an issue. You come, the best of scientists come, we continue or maintain our contacts with the world through the virtual message of scientific work. But from time to time you have to feel. You have to see the eyes. You have to even feel the warmth, the hug, the smile. You can feel it in Skype, part of it, not necessarily every time. Now we create some maybe substitutes to this feeling. Michal is in the field of biology and computer sciences. She may create some of these things. But I do refer to the meetings that we have. To this very meeting, that you made the efforts to come to Jerusalem. It's not only the efforts, it's not only coming to the Middle East. For us, it's the feeling of the neighborhood. The meaning of neighbors, the sharing with the responsibility for the future of science with you. So the days that you dedicate to Horizon 2020 and the days that you are going to dedicate to the continuous work of yourselves, thank you for having us among yourselves, is from my point of view the reason for disturbing you in the middle of your lectures. And I came to say it in the best candid way that I can say. I said at the beginning in some ironic, it's not self-understood. It's not the issue of self-understanding. It's much more than that. We all give each other the feeling of belonging, but at the same time it's not only belonging. It's not a passive feeling. We are the ones who are the responsible ones for the future of science in Europe, in the world, to spread the world of science, to come with a paper, and it's not fooling ourselves, and to know that it is the meaningful part of our life, but it's very important for the world, not only in terms of cashing it into patents, but to understand the meaning of humanity. That's what we are sharing with. That is the message that I take from you and then bring to the people. So it's spring outside. In less than 24 hours you feel it again. And you see what's the meaning of the best time of renovation of the world. And nature creates new things for us, from the blooming part to the new life of many species, and that's what we do daily. We create, we innovate, and that's our responsibility. And each of the countries, we are the strategic, solid element of our society. And you're going to talk about books. So if I was accepted, I were accepted, I would have told you about canonization of books. And I'll give you one case study. I asked Michal, how long am I going to get? So, sure, Simon, you are going to get me for a few more minutes. We asked ourselves a few years ago in research groups in the humanities, and we insisted that this research group creates all different aspects of the university. That's the meaning of universe. So we had biologists with us, we had psychologists, social sciences. That's part of the legacy of Professor Kedar. And the questions that we asked were very simple. Why books die or remain classical? Why Shakespeare is Shakespeare and others not? Why Einstein is still the best show, and only a few buildings from here, there are 80,000 documents of Einstein. We put it on the internet a year and a half ago. We had 25 million entering in 1 week. Most of them from the East, from China. And I'm not going to give you the answer in one sentence. For that, we'll have another occasion. We took one example that, fortunately enough, we have it in Jewish culture, and we compare it to other cultures. You know, books died and disappeared, but they were kept as religious pieces of information or important parts of information through the ages. We have a collection. Those of you who came from England, in Cambridge, there are around 600,000 documents of the Cairo Geniza, but in Manchester you have around 5,000. In London you have around 3,000, and it's spread over the world. That's the lack of scientists. So you take the plane and you move from one place to another to 25 different libraries, and you have a figure. Let's take a figure, Said ibn Yusuf al-Fayoumi. He was born in 882, died in 942, so it's between the 7th and 14th centuries. He wrote 29 books. Out of his 9 books, 2 survived. But nowadays we can reconstruct 27 others. So what's the difference between those who survived and those who didn't? Maybe because those 2 were written in lingua franca, yes, in Hebrew? Not necessarily. So that's the question we asked ourselves. Then we discovered that in many other cultures, you have the same parallel phenomenon in churches, in cemeteries, in mosques. You have remnants of culture that were kept because of the religious aspect, or they were important because one reason or another. Then you can compare it to the classical one. And you can ask the question, what's the secret of being canonical? I'll end with the following sentence. It has to do with what you do in your institutes. It's not the one answer among the answers that we answered ourselves, the group. You need some establishment behind in order to keep it. The establishment could be monastery. The establishment could be set of schools. But if there are no people who are responsible for keeping the gist of the time, the spirit, the works, then they might disappear. Maybe by accident they'll resurface. But a lot has to do with the gatekeepers of the knowledge, of the culture, and those felt responsible for many years. So it's not the only one answer. It's partial answer, but it has to do with yourselves. You are in charge of keeping it. Then somebody else does it. So until you go back to the bench of the lab, of the library, of your own work, to the research groups, this is now the time, the term that you are in charge. We are in charge. Let's do it the best way. In knowing that we keep the torch in order then to leave it to the others who are going to be the next responsible ones. Being neighbors, gatekeepers, awareing of the missions that we have, the sky is the limit, and I stopped disturbing you from your own important business. Thank you for coming.
Your time is safe. Thanks very much. We will do. Thanks very much, Menachem. It's lovely to see you back. Yeah. And it'd be good to invite you back to the Taylor Schechter Genese Institute as soon as you want to come, of course, back in Cambridge. You should come and do some work there, right? Anyway, I think we'll take 5 minutes of questions, if we can, and then we will go to the next paper, and then we'll do some general things. So I think it'd be good to take questions immediately. Yeah, please.
Thanks for your talk. You mentioned at the beginning of the talk religious virtue, and then later on you went on to this Aristotelian cluster of success and the fact that it's the tool of finding virtue. So was there back then, in the 6th century, something like an established virtue ethics, so that you had a cluster or list of religious virtues, and what are they then? And second, was this the established definition, this Aristotelian one, which was not even formed by Aristotle himself, right? So as a general definition, that every virtue is the middle ground between excess and act. So was this the definition for intellectual or theoretic virtues?
Well, in a sense, yes, there was a kind of curriculum of virtue ethics, at least in this monastery of Dorotheus. We have a number of lectures given by Dorotheus to his brothers in the Cenobium, and these lectures actually reflect very closely what ancient philosophers also did in their talks and diatribes, and it looks very similar, and even the set of virtues is almost exactly the same, apart from the special emphasis that is given to strict obedience and humility. That's of course the Christian fingerprint that is put on this virtue ethics. But otherwise, the terms in which Dorotheus and also John and Barsanuphius discuss the virtues are very similar to the Stoic mainstream in ancient philosophy. And of course, I don't want to say that Dorotheus actually consulted Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics to borrow this definition of virtue. But what I wanted to say is that this definition of virtue as the middle between excess and lack had become a mainstay of ethics in antiquity, of course, and it was adopted by Christian church fathers like Basil as well. But strikingly, Dorotheus also quotes Epictetus and other philosophers, or roughly quotes them, without acknowledging his debt whatsoever. He only quotes the Desert Fathers, Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus, and so on. And there's no such distinction as in Aristotle between Dianoetic and other virtues. That's not his concern. It's rather about the practice of virtue and habituation, and not so much about subtle definition. Yeah. Sixth century. Yes. To a certain extent, yes, even if not directly referencing Augustine and other church fathers, but I think there's a significant shift from the times of Augustine to the 6th century. In the times of Augustine, or also Gregory of Nazianzus, John Chrysostom, the discussion is rather about this way from the pagan classics to Christianity, and about the at least partial rejection of classical literature, and they feel the need to distance themselves from this pagan tradition. Whereas in Dorotheus, we actually have one nice cameo in one of his lectures where he talks about his secular schooling. He went to the rhetorical school and learned rhetoric, literature, and so on, and then he moved to the monastery and says in this lecture, and then I devoted exactly the same effort that I previously devoted to literature, now to Christian virtue and asceticism. But he doesn't feel the need to distance himself from this. And I think that has to do with the question whether or not pagan or classical literature still posed a threat to Christianity. And I think that was no longer the case in the 6th century. It was rather about a negotiation of sacred and secular, and not this dichotomy of pagan and Christian.
Could you just add a word on that, about the difference between being in the Greek East versus Roman West? Because after all, that makes a big difference. You've got Augustine is
Yes.
not even read by Greek.
No.
So, you know, that makes a big difference. And
Perhaps
you could say, in regard to that,
yeah.
when you've got Gaza as a center, possibly, but you went straight into monastic culture, in the same period you could go around to Panopolis in Egypt and you could look at someone like Nonus in the 5th century, 6th century, and you would have a Christian writing a 48-book epic on Dionysus, the Greek god.
Yeah.
And if you go north to Beirut, you're going to have a completely legal school.
Yes.
So to what degree is Gaza, and you say, is this a unique place, a special
Yes.
place? Is it a Greek place? Is it a monastic place?
Thank you for this important point, and that's actually at the center of my project. I'm convinced that this cultural fingerprint or profile has very much to do with the local context, and that also applies to Augustine, to Alexandria, to Berytus, and other places in this time. Many schools, or schools, institutions, or how should we define them, are closely related to this local context and influenced by local configurations and social interactions. And I think that's visible in Gaza. And what may be unique about Gaza is perhaps this close interaction between monasteries, villages, and the city of Gaza, and that we there have encounters between secular teachers and monks and the bishop and clergy, and that creates a kind perhaps of multicultural atmosphere or something like that, to put it in modern terms. Well, that's of course a difficult question and hard to answer in a few sentences, but I think what makes a difference is perhaps this these close interactions, these everyday encounters between monks, ordinary citizens, educated men, the clergy, and that they all had a keen interest in questions of education, and on a daily basis reflected about education. And I think in this environment where people moved from secular schools to the monastery, became monks, and then lectured to their brothers in the monastery, that's also a striking feature, that made it more made it easier to perhaps to combine aspects of both cultures and to avoid this kind of clash of two different value systems.
Well, you partly answered the question, the response, but I mean, just to put this on with it, because this continues, I think, with this, what you are showing us, the question and the possibilities of having polyphonic cultures as a go a century later, right? We see the continuation in Damascus and other places, precisely along the same lines of how you use the, in that case, the from the Arabian Peninsula, the pagan literature, but also the Greek. But exactly as you say, and I think, and I missed a little bit in your presentation, but you did it now in your responses, the relevance of the context in which this is happening, and precisely because you speak about education, so you emphasize the bookish aspect of it, right, and the exegesis, and this, but not so much precisely what are the conditions that make it possible to be in a productive, but not always peaceful, sometimes also more forceful combat about what is the right way, but it may be then seen indeed as a specific feature of that region of the late antiquity that we see if you look at Alexandria, Damascus, Gaza, and other places, that we do have these systems of education in place, schools and universities, that they were precisely based on that fruitful tension.
Yeah. Of course, I couldn't address this important aspect of my project here because of the time limit of my talk. But I think that is definitely a decisive factor in this education discourse in Gaza. And we can see this in the speeches of Coricius and also of Procopius and his predecessor Aeneas, that they relate very much this education discourse to the civic environment. This kind of cultural discourse is part of the festivity culture of Gaza. For instance, when the bishop dedicates a new church with the cycle of images of Christ, Mary, and so on, he commissions a speech by Coricius to depict these images in the traditional rhetorical fashion. And Coricius explains all these images in the church building. He describes this church building in Gaza in completely classical terms. And that shows that at least the bishop and the clergy of Gaza appreciated this classical culture and thought that it was appropriate to express Christian imagery, Christian traditions in this classical framework.
It's fascinating that they inherit a language of antiquity. They inherit the language, say, from Tertullian or from Jerome, Ciceronianus, no Christianus, or from Tertullian, and what is Jerusalem to do with Athens? So they can do antiquity, and somehow they manage to transfer that language of antiquity into something else in cultural terms. And that's what perhaps a very interesting lesson for today.
Yes.
Inherited hatred and antiquity doesn't mean we have to continue.
That would be great. Yeah.
Anyway, I think we should perhaps move on. Glenn, if you'd like to come up, and we should thank.
So this isn't on.
All of both of them.
Thanks, Michael. So this mic is working, this one isn't. That's correct, right? So I don't need that. So as soon as, and usually before, brush clears, trowel cuts, hand lifts, whatever physical operation brings an object to air, light, and life in the field, culture takes hold of the process. The thing uncovered is ongoing change to become something for us. From that vantage point, I'd like to propose a slightly different method of approach for understanding the provisional proposition that is the early Christian icon. I'll talk primarily about this little-known, small painted panel now at the Menil Collection in Houston, Texas, in terms of its archaeological identity, its provenance, its physical condition, its visual iconography, and its historical meaning and context, which is often called history of art. Oh, I thought this was working. Is this not? Oh, I understood when they put it on that this was going to be the mic. So I should go back to this. Right. So was I clear enough with that first paragraph, or should I start again? Is it okay? Okay. 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 I couldn't tell how loud this was. So this method that I'm proposing is a kind of archaeology as I understand it, since it comprises a stratigraphic penetration of object and a description of those layers that in the order I give brings the object to light and gives it culture, that is, absorbs it into our own. But this little icon has other identities not the least dependent on my or anyone's verbal capture of it. It has a strikingly open quality, for one thing. It is broken, it's patched together, its state reveals an active and unsettled relationship between and among surface and structure, age and youth, cohesion and disintegration. In another way, the icon is surprisingly innocent of our explanations, both in the sense that it doesn't really care, and in the sense that it has largely escaped study. The former can be taken or left. As I say, it doesn't really matter to it either way, but the latter is more obviously noteworthy for us as scholars, since the icon dates probably to the 6th or 7th century, it comes probably from Egypt, and it belongs to a large subclass of archaeology or history of art of related objects with vanquishing equestrian figures. So I have no real end game, but I'm using this exhibition, the catalog from a show called The Way of the Shovel, as an inspiration. And this talk will note possibilities and describe historical trajectories. And it'll try a kind of an archaeology of sorts, a term, I believe, coined by Bill Brown at the University of Chicago, in which the cultural operations, exhibition, conservation, religion, academic inquiry around this icon play equal roles. This array of points of analysis comprises an archaeology, related to archaeology through difference and invested in its ceaseless reorganization, its reappraisal, its re-uncovering of ourselves as much as the object under question. So, the definition of icon is not itself straightforward. The word semantic indeterminacy needs to be recognized because that aspect forms its basic instability as an historical artifact. In Greek, ikon can mean anything from mental image to idea or plan to physical object. Icons were not invented by Christians, but borrowed and refined for its own purposes. So Hans Belting carefully unpacked the Roman roots of the Christian icon, the imperial cult, death portraiture, religious customs throughout society, to list the most significant that he covered. His real contribution, in my opinion, is a thoroughgoing treatment of the development of the cult of icons in this period of late antiquity within the logic of our art history. Belting begins his book by positing a divergence in interests between icons and theologians, a point still not widely attended to. For him, art can be illuminated by church theory and practice, but it need not be determined or exhausted by them. This insight opens up many ways of seeing icons as intersubjective. Icons are not passive representations of theology, nor are they objects of devotional hope, nor even sites of desire. They are independent agents, able to contend with and contradict officials, that is both state and ecclesiastic, and they are able to demonstrate a nearly complete sense of subjecthood, just like most humans around them. So this horizontal dissemination of icons in society I'm arguing for resists object closure or discretion. Agency spreads throughout. It keeps time non-linear. It opens forward and backward in an era of ever-imminent judgment. And it traverses place. It's self-disclosed, its interest in its replicability, that is, its repeatability. So the statement that I'll make, objects realize the past for us, seems to me more or less unobjectionable. But the space that looks productive is between an object's emergence to our consciousness and our making of it after that fashion. So might there be a generative gap in between oblivion and absorption, where we can imagine a thing before analogy takes hold of it, and to subvert and to revert to archaeology at the same time? This is a kind of anarchaeologie. So my primary object for imagining and discussing this process again is this small painted panel in the Menil collection. Like all icons, it has no title. Many have original inscriptions. This does not. The correct identity can seem important, and so arises in this way their organic serial relationship with each thing sharing the same name or form, and I'm leaving the model purposely out of that formula. This small panel may have had such a nominating inscription, but if it had, the state of preservation does not allow us to know that for certain. So the panel is simply titled, for inventory purposes by the museum, Unidentified Warrior Saint. The horse that he is riding is an important element of the panel's visual communication, but the human figure is exclusively credited. Not necessarily all that important, but I just want to give the horse its due for a short time. The condition of the panel is now stable. It's pinned by metal clamps to a wooden backing. So it's stable, but it's been badly damaged at different points in its past. The wood, probably cedar, has been broken in several places. The gesso, the plaster bed in which the pigments have been placed, is badly abraded and is missing in several places. And the pigment, which is wax encaustic in this case, has also flaked and worn. While some later retouching is almost evident and seen in conservators' tests, and this is a drawing of such. The hair of the male figure and the muzzle of the horse seem to have been touched up. The panel had painting on its reverse, which I'll talk about as well, but we can't actually see it in person because of the wooden board clamped to the reverse of the icon now. So it had painting on the reverse, and we normally, in any case, privilege the figural passage, which we call the obverse here. And the reverse was done in a red-orange, a rather elaborate cross filling the whole field on that side. And one further objective observation is to note scale. The panel is 20 by 12 by 0.635 centimeters, so quite small. One should ask of this panel, if it is still close enough to its original states that we can treat it as artifact, or if it has so dramatically diminished in itself that it is a nearly empty fragment. It skates around both these possible positions at the same time. The perceptual and analytic encounter with this object is heavily mediated already. Layers of material damage and revision, conservational choices of areas left bare and partly so, like medical textbooks that show cutaway sections of skin, flesh, and bone, which is here paint, gesso, and wood. There are also material impediments, the backing and its clamps that one would see in person now, and even institutional hurdles to clear for access to it. I myself have never seen the reverse of the icon in person. It's never been unclamped for me to study. All these facets create modes of excavation, stratigraphy, and classifying. So conventional art historical practice needs to take account of other elements, I believe. Disciplinary tradition and formation make it so. If we proceed stratigraphically downward, the first layer needing descriptive clearing is the figural grounds. In the upper third of the obverse, which you see on the right-hand side, a male figure faces and squares shoulders to the picture plane. He nonetheless directs his vision upward, signaled by the white of his eyes that create crescent moons resting on his cheekbones. In his right hand, he holds a staff or a spear, which seems to have a tassel at the head of its shaft. He is seated on a horse which is smaller in proportion to that human on its back, and the horse looks downward in a very expressive way. Something appears to have been on the ground below him, though what that might be is not clear, since the lower half of the panel descends into an increasingly obscure field with significant passages taken over by scraped clean wood. Proceeding downward stratigraphically, which always means for us more profoundly, more radically, more significantly, subsequent layers reveal coherence and meaning. The vertical has value while the horizontal fails to probe. The panel itself is uncovered, and it has entered an archaeological culture already, though perhaps it can withdraw later as well. But for now, the panel has to enter more fully into a disciplinary area that the inevitably leading description that I've just given has indicated as appropriate. In our now developing stratigraphy, the panel needs more context. Comparison is the great friend of archaeologists and art historians. Without analogy, those fields would have nothing but unmanageable, unclassifiable unica. and nothing proceeds in not just these academic disciplines without analogy. Positioning an object like this unnoticed before the mid-1980s in the public record in time and place can only proceed through analogy. Therefore, that is, finding horizontal matches in the stratigraphy. And those matches circle back onto the original object, so a recovery and then recovering with new meaning. Early icons are notoriously difficult to date, and they are also exceedingly rare. Most are found at the venerable monastery of St. Catherine in Egypt, but some have made their way to Kiev, Paris, or Berlin, and have always been in Rome. Few wayward icons have made themselves known, and this Menil panel is a unique survival in a North American museum, to my knowledge. My close reading of this icon in terms of its directional energies and its figural subtleties might leave me open to charges of simply working from photographs and neglecting the real thing's possibilities in real space, place, and time. But in the first instance, I try to use the photographic description against itself, and here I show the museum file photographs which give the color guides and the identifying labels. I try to use these photographs against themselves as a misleading intervention towards an ideal, presently unknowable state. And in the second, that this small panel performed its material magic precisely through this invitation to close examination on the part of its owners. Too small for communal devotional practice, this panel must have sat on a small private altar, on a shelf or a niche by a liminal space like a door or a window, an entry into an alcove, or even as a portable icon that traveled with particularly devout Christians. Such small things are paradoxically totalizing. They reverse scales, they bring us down to their level, and by commanding that reversal, they overwhelm and exclude. In these circumstances, the icon, intent by candle warmth, this mutual interrogation can take place. Moreover, in these very circumstances, things always perform their homicidal logic. Who needs the prototype when you have this compelling, engulfing little thing to perform hopes and desires on? The prototype is distant, it's obsolete, it's made redundant by this miraculously present entity, whose attention is fixed on and beyond one. It faces you and it looks away, the rider's gaze most literally, at the very same time, and its presence performs distilled power. While the description above that I've given shows how a reading of form to gain narrative purchase on a thing can function, this panel also operates as emblem, as something more than itself. It stands in a long pre-Christian line of riding warriors who take care of incoherent threat in the world, and the proof is in the timeless series that it finds itself in. The identity of the riding warrior on the Menil icon may not be retrievable, and it may not matter. His actions are predictable and they're reliable. Their materialization in this way makes the real thing, that is the model, useless in any case. Once the thing is in our possession, relying on the faulty and unseeable lines of communication that ostensibly connect humanity and heaven appears rightly foolish, whatever theologians might say to the contrary. The thing is here and it's not elsewhere. The constantly shifting of the earth around this artifact shows its archaeological depths, its limitless layers of sedimenting. Now, some of that sedimenting already discussed has shored up, ironically, in the disappearing fields of paint, where signs of restoration by modern conservators have already been noted. This absence of paint and presence of wooden support is an authentic sign of age. According to Regal, it declares its age value. For us to generalize, this damage manifests its antiquity and its cultural preciousness, which is constantly under threat from invisible dangers. Chemistry tells us this fact. And the icon needs us for its survival, thus our pact with our objects. But another way of cutting across this sedimentation is possible. In the period under question, hagiographies or saints' lives written for Christian history and edification narrates the scraping of paint and the ingesting of those flakes and particles with water, wine, or oil. The obvious conclusion upon seeing this icon is that centuries have left its mark on its surface, but the mark may be less than impersonal, as time is often taken to be impersonal, and rather due to a common human need for erasing boundaries, dividing powerful things from our own bodies. By ingesting, our mouths can take the other inside ourselves, and that matter can remake our interior into an integral whole with the powerful intensities of that world. Christian testimony exists in this period and into the modern world of ingesting pigments and other materials considered holy and powerful, and objects often show signs of intrusion, that is, rubbing, flaking, gouging, and so on. Matching these actions to specific objects is particularly difficult. We can't really do it. But the actions of positive destruction can never be ruled out entirely. So the cross painted on the back of the icon performs multiple tasks also, potentially and simultaneously. The cross on the reverse of the icon seals the object from rear attack, and so it is then an impregnable object, able to fend off any threat from any direction. The power of the writer's actions both derives from and ratifies the cross. The two sides operating at the same time, if not ever viewable at the same time, create an ensemble that is cumulatively like a body, with front and back and even flayed open, like in the photograph you're seeing, front and back to allow a kind of post-mortem autopsy. The miniature body of the icon is like some condensed and powerful version of a fully realized body, not human but fleshed out, dimensionalized, and in full relation to the world around it. So, the neglected side of the icon, the just visible cross, is more than just visible. It draws its matrix, the icon as surface for meaning, into a system of revelation, what waits behind or underneath, and it gives movement. A perfectly still face, the cross side expresses a process of unfolding, of leading to some other facet of the icon, which is the active writer, making visual material his relational energy. An icon can be a heterotopic site, as Foucault would argue, I believe. It is itself, while it still self-undermines its discretion with its open signs and shared processes of meaning and making. And yet this icon is nothing but surplus. Its vulnerability, its bandaging supports, its quiet nostalgia, and in spite of all that, its shaping, confident self-existence. An archaeology of an icon can look a little like this performance, glancing steps sideways that refuse to plant on solid ground. So how does this icon think and perform its worlds now and in the past? It has had many over the course of its many centuries, and those worlds have not been discrete, but potentially spilling, latching, draining, filling, both in its orbiting and everything in its orbit as it coursed its path. And in the end, anarchaeology reverts to that process whereby the earth always reclaims its own. No end but constant excavation. Thank you.
Okay, some questions, please. I'll start while people are thinking of their question. I'd like to take you back to the semantics a little bit and take it forward from there. And I'd like to ask you a little bit about this extraordinary object that you described as possibly a spear with a tassel. Now, I'm not a deeply military man, but a spear with a tassel sounds to me like a bit of a paradox. And so I'd like to ask a little bit about, can you look at this without metaphorization? You talked about analogy as your model, and I wondered whether metaphor might not be a crucial part of the way we view, in the sense that the militia Christi, the militia that we're actually looking at here, has to always take a detour through some sort of metaphor to make sense. And it's completely concealed by, as always, the museum's ludicrous title. And what the hell is a warrior saint? So how do you view warrior saints without metaphor?
Right. Right. So that's a metaphor of our own creation, of course.
Well, a Christian metaphor, to be fair. It's a very deep,
yeah, sure. Sure. But it's our endowment. No, I would push back against that in the sense that my argument really rests on a almost complete evacuation of metaphor from the reading and understanding of an object like this. And a metaphor would most obviously work if we were thinking of the copy-model relation, which is why I was trying to push back on really trying to identify the figure and even to posit the importance of it referring to an original prototype. Because the argument of looking at an object like this in the way I am trying to do means that you can only take it on its own terms, and it is directly what it presents itself as. And so yeah, no, please.
But if one looks at the Christian material that we have and how you use an icon, there are two models that are used. One is the one that you looked at, which was the very physical one, and we know about kissing and biting and sucking and licking and all the things that you can do to that icon, which means you're certainly not just looking at it.
Right.
But the other model is a model of identification, whereby you lie on the ground and you look and you cry, and you say, I want to be like this figure is the figure I wish to adopt, in which case you can't not metaphorize. You have to have a relation to that. So are you separating it from the theology of viewing that is actually contemporary to the period?
Yeah, I thought you were going to say something else. No, the latter, where you're performing some act of piety or devotion or whatever it is in front of the object. It is the object that you're performing that in front of. You may have sources that would describe some other kind of materialization, but there's only the object. And what I was also trying to use Hans Belting's work for was a way of understanding these objects without necessary reference to the text which we so often marshal to explain them and to neutralize them. But I would say that those texts that we so often talk about, where Basil the Great says we only are passing our honor to the prototype when we address an icon, that's a theologian's explanation, but it's also a theologian's attempt at control and inoculation. And so that would be the way in which I would also push back on the other explanations. Those other worlds are possible, but they're possible in orbit around the objects and in ways that are antagonistic and suspicious and actually quite fearful. And this is almost the first sentence in Belting's book, which I find so profoundly useful, but as I say, hasn't really been followed up very well, that icons, that theologians are constantly causing fear, suspicion, and anxiety amongst theologians. And that's the tension that needs to be addressed.
If you went to a different model, if you went to someone like Prudentius, admittedly 4th century in Spanish, but nonetheless,
right.
he would talk about rolling on the floor and crying in front of an icon.
Right.
What do you do that? That's usually as a model of suffering, reproducing suffering. I mean, the archetypal model is observance of the crucifixion and observing the suffering and taking on the suffering and the suffering being taken on. It's a reciprocal relation of performance of suffering.
Right.
What is the reciprocal relation of performance with this?
Yeah, or something like this. Yeah, yeah. So there are a couple of things. I mean, I don't doubt some level of veracity with those sorts of sources that are showing a kind of emotional, physical reaction to these objects. I'm sure that's true on some level, but those are sources that what would you say, that we extract and apply in ways that allow us, I would say, to continue that distance and that lack of, well, what would you say really, a kind of respect that an object itself deserves. And that then may be something we can imagine. That is to say, we can imagine somebody feeling that kind of emotional connection with an object. But it is an imagined state for us. That's not quite addressing it in the way that I'd like to, but that's what I have right now.
I'm interested in the social text, in the social life of this icon. I was wondering about the readability, as separate from a textualized construction. So my field is much later, but I'm also interested in this kind of religious iconography and how religious iconography, once it's popularized, doesn't necessarily be related to a textual source. How, for instance, very cheaply printed works like this, but that's why I'm thinking about the format. This is a mobile medium, not necessarily for display on an altar, but also for educational purposes. Could this have been used among communities for certain purposes of instruction, very much like in the late Middle Ages, beginning of the early modern period, cheap print material was used just for the iconic value, which then had to be inscribed by the person interpreting it, but without an actual textualized existence of manuscript or printed text. Of course, we're not thinking about printed text here, but there is a clear severance between the textualized typographic or manuscript text in those particular sources. And listening to you and looking at the image, there seems to be a possibility of this being a predecessor of some of the Western reading practices that were developed, let's say, in the early modern period in corporateur literature. When you have images like that, they're clearly not related to actual manuscript text. It's an oral culture that underpins them, but it's the iconic value as opposed to a textualized existence that's always foregrounded.
Yeah, and so I suppose the first thing that came to mind was Gregory the Great's injunction for the proper use of images, which is the Bibles of the illiterate. And there are ways in which icons like this could conceivably have been used pedagogically, didactically. It is very small, though, 20 centimeters. It's a pocket-sized piece, as you say. So its didactic qualities are understated, and it belongs to a series of images that are most often found in archaeological contexts and other iconographies as being more protective or apotropaic, often belonging to a magical realm of protection and surveillance.
I conceived of these before listening to us in elite media, that ultimately they were not elite media,
Right.
because they were mass-produced.
Yes.
And it's that mass production element that, of course, caters for a much broader reading public than we usually assume. So we see them as very special objects, but they wouldn't really have been that special within the visual public area.
No, that's very good. Yeah, and that could play it with the horizontal and the vertical stratigraphies as well, that would allow you to see this as a very different class of object if you were able to treat it in a non-archaeological fashion. Because we're finding this thing, it's a remarkable survival. There's nothing really like it, and scarcely published.
Some things aren't discussed. Someone like Paulinus of Nola, when he talks about the use of images, he's talking about major, large-scale church images. This isn't the church, and that's what's so fascinating. That's why your material is actually spot on.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask if you could say more about the method of unarchaeology. And I was a bit confused or curious about how you think about the relation between different time layers, I guess, because in some parts of the presentation you're saying we should take the object as it is, seems to mean we should also take us as the contemporary viewers of the object and kind of work with the object that we have now, rather than trying to reconstruct what the object once might have been. And then at other times, I mean, now in this conversation, we do seem to be also very interested in what one might call the original context, or the context and the uses for which the object was created, and reconstructing those.
Yeah.
So, how do you think about the
Yeah.
relationship between?
No, that's a really interesting question too. And so, it is a kind of performance, isn't it? Because I need to both address the field expectations, which belong to iconography, form, original context, and those sorts of things, but also, and so create a kind of historical distance between myself and the object. But the exercise I was trying to also perform was to imagine that distance coexisting with proximity. And so it belongs to a method, I think, which is close to, say, a Foucauldian heterotopia, where you're both in a space which is present and subverts itself at the same moment. It's itself and something else. And those liminal spaces of experience can also be liminal spaces of analysis. So the way in which I was trying to and Bill Brown's use of anarchaeologie is like Foucault's heterotopia, very usefully vague, in the sense that it's a blueprint for a method rather than a very carefully spelled out or even demonstrated method. And so for that reason, I found the exhibition and the essays in the catalog to be highly useful for speculating on how one could both perform these historical acts of analysis that we're trained to do and expected to perform, but also to use the experience of knowing as incompletely as I do this object, because as I say, I've only seen the front in person. The reverse has never been made available to me. And so using that both intimate and restricted knowledge also becomes one of the ways in which I want to try to understand, almost in collapsed fashion, the stratigraphies that an object like this would present us.
I think one way to bring the other paper in that makes it very interesting is that the Young's paper was trying very hard not only to historicize but also to localize, to say actually it's this place at this time, it's other. And that makes a difference. But here we're having an attempt to go beyond historicization or to try and bypass historicization in the name of something else. And it's quite interesting because, of course, this would seem to be the most local, precise little object around the text. So there's some tension between the two papers that is quite interesting. What sort of analysis of the late antique you might wish to offer?
Right, right. Well, thank you.
Do you have any more? Yes, please.
It's hard for me to do this without having the kind of comparanda as a control, so forgive me. But I'm wondering about the sort of inaccessibility of the reverse, both in the concrete, you not see in the back, and in the sort of broader kind of phenomenon of the almost blank cross, or the blankness of the cross on the reverse, which in some sense is sealing the holiness, but at the same time it's definitely the B side of this ancient record, right?
Right.
And you know, I can think of a couple cases, and this is where the comparanda come in, of the cross being on the front of something, like the Vatican reliquary box of objects collected around here from roughly the same period of time. But the sort of this object is sort of making me think about the persistence of this kind of B-side crossing that is going on. And I'm wondering where you are thinking anarchaeologically about it here. Is there something appropriate about the control of the display of this object so that the back is not much more visible than it probably was most of the time in the entire history of this object?
Well, it depends how you think about display in its useful life. Probably it was very mobile and so was used in ways that would allow its objectness, its three-dimensionality, to come out much more clearly than it can do now. It's very seldom exhibited. I don't think the Menil really knows that although I've told them, that they have an extremely valuable object. It's extremely rare. And yet they don't display it, and for reasons that they consider to be important for its preservation, they don't allow it to be, would you say, unpacked now, unsealed, because it has these little metal clamps that hold a wooden backing to the reverse of the icon. And so that does determine, to a large degree, the kinds of thinking that one can do. And we don't often allow ourselves to be held up at that moment, and that's also what I'm trying to imagine what those impediments can mean for not so much where we end up, but the way in which we travel to those conclusions. The seriality is extremely important. I mean, this is what I'm trying to resist in terms of metaphor, is the way in which it can be taken as something more than itself, and it is already more than itself might be, if you see what I mean. But it does belong in both its obverse and reverse to a long series that predate Christianity. Even the cross, you could say, in Egypt predates Christianity. And so it also doesn't really need a model. No model really any longer exists. There's no prototype for an object that's so deeply into seriality. And that's something that we allow theologians to take away from us. That is, past theologians, not contemporary theologians. Although that's probably also true. But we allow theologians to set up a duality in which the object itself, that is something in the material world, which we can hold, measure, understand to some degree, that is somehow effaced through the need for a prototype. And that prototype relationship supersedes all the other relationships in terms of our historical explanations of devotion and faith.
There's a wonderful paper by the Chinese art historian in Chicago on the ancient mirrors. And why is it that we always look at the back of ancient mirrors? Because they're the decoration. When we go to an exhibition of mirrors, they will show the back. I said, you should show the front, because that's the thing you look at, right? And I said, well, of course, that's the classic model to think about, is that in order to look at the decoration, you can't look at yourself. And then you have to look at yourself and you can't see the decoration. And that's part of the game of what a mirror does. And presumably in devotional texts, there's something going on that's quite interesting about what you see at the front of the back and you use it like that. And that would be, I think,
And I suppose the only thing I would add is you have to think about the gaze, because you're not the only person being looked at in that case.
I think it's probably time for coffee. And we should thank you very much.